Good evening. Welcome to this meeting of the Foundation for Science and Technology. We'll just pause a moment while the participants pour in for our event. Thank you very much for joining us. Just give another minute as the participants all arrive. Good. Well, welcome to this event of the Foundation for Science and Technology on the crucial topic, will hydrogen technologies get us to net zero? Before we turn to the main proceedings this evening, I would just like to take a few moments to note the passing of the Earl of Selborne, John Selborne, who was our chairman at the Foundation for 12 years. He was a crisp, effective, wonderful chairman. He was also a man with a profound interest in the natural world. He cared about it. He was a genuine expert. He had been president of the Royal Geographical Society. He'd been chairman of the trustees at Kew. And throughout his time as chair, Dougal Goodman worked alongside him as our chief executive. And I'm now going to invite Dougal just to say a few words about the late John Selborne.
Thank you, David. I'd just like to say a few words of tribute to a person who I thoroughly enjoyed working with. John was a remarkable man. He was astute, knowledgeable and pragmatic, but also as a person he was unpretentious and modest. He joined the Council of the Foundation in 1989 when he was chairman of the Agriculture and Food Research Council. For the next 30 years, he gave freely of his time to support the work of the Foundation, serving as a member of the Financial and General Purposes Committee and on the Search Committee, which recruited me as chief executive in 2000. In 2006, he took over from Patrick Jenkin, and after 12 years, handed the baton to David Willetts in 2018. John was always willing to prioritize his diary to chair Foundation meetings. He gave me a steer about themes for future events, whilst giving me the freedom to make the choice about what should be debated and who the speakers should be. His kindly nature showed through in our one-to-one meetings, which were held in the House of Lords tea room because he knew I liked the toasted tea cakes. It was a great privilege and pleasure to work for John. He was an exceptionally good chairman. He was able to build consensus even when there were strong divergent views in the room. And at the end of the debates, was able to summarize in a few well-chosen sentences what had happened. He certainly liked to stick to the time in meetings. Participants in debates knew when they were taking too long to make a statement or phrase a question. Some Foundation's meetings stand out. I think the one that we most enjoyed was when we had the three astronauts, Neil Armstrong, Jim Lovell and Eugene Cernan, the first and last mate to work on the moon, and one who nearly didn't come back. John was committed to public service, influencing policy decisions, particularly with the science element that had an impact on all of us, but did so in a calm, well-mannered way, drawing on his lifetime of experience. He served on a multitude of committees, usually as the chair, and he was particularly fond of the Lord's Science Select Committee, which allowed him to chair the meeting for 2 sessions, which, in short, John made an enormous contribution to the work of the Foundation. Without his help, we would not be where we are today. His sound advice will be sorely missed. An obituary will be published in the April issue of the Foundation Journal. Thank you. Back to David.
Thank you very much, Dougal. Let us just have a moment to pause and reflect on the life of John Selborne. Thank you very much indeed. Well, let us now turn to the topic of the hour. Will hydrogen technologies get us to net zero? The government, of course, committed us to reaching net zero in 2019, and there is a recognition that, especially with some of the crucial, hardest to decarbonize sectors, hydrogen is going to be key to finding a way forward. But hydrogen itself is energy intensive, hence the focus on green production of hydrogen in significant quantities. I know from my conversations with Kwasi Kwarteng when he was energy minister, how focused he was on the challenge of hydrogen and the production of green hydrogen. There is now a Hydrogen Advisory Council, which Kwasi continues to chair as a business secretary. And of course, with COP26 coming up, it's very important as one of the themes for our foundation discussions this year that we focus on the challenge of climate change, and hydrogen is going to play a crucial part in that. We've got three excellent speakers. I will turn to them in a moment, but first of all, just on practicalities, do of course feel free to use the Q&A function if you've got any questions. Don't use the chat function. We prefer Q&A, and on Q&A you can vote up the questions that you identify as being ones that you strongly endorse, which helps me as chair identify the questions that we should focus on. And do start tabling your questions and upvoting questions from the beginning. You don't need to wait until the end of the presentations. Now let me go straight to our first speaker, Nigel Topping. Nigel is the UK's high-level climate change action champion, appointed by the Prime Minister. He is, his role is to work with businesses, investors, organisations, cities, in all the representative bodies participating in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And he is a formidable, energetic and focused campaigner planning forward for COVID, for the next meeting of COP26. He was, before that, CEO of We Mean Business, coalition of businesses working to accelerate the transition to a zero carbon economy. And he has a record of engagement and business leadership before that. So Nigel, it's very good of you, given how busy you are in the run-up to COP26, to join us this evening, and we very much look forward to your presentation. Nigel, over to you.
Well, thank you, David. It's a real pleasure to join you. You know, one of the exciting things about the work I do now is that it's really about building ambition and confidence about the pathways to get to zero, and increasingly we're seeing that being a collaborative process where main actors around whole value chains are coming together and sort of pre-competitively agreeing what the next steps are. And I think green hydrogen is a prime example of that, with a lot of excitement about it, but still at very early stage. So I'd start by saying I'm not an expert in hydrogen. Nearly everything I've learned about this transition is through, I sat on the Energy Transitions Commission, which is chaired by Adair Turner, who many of you will know, and RJ Mathur. And we published a report called Mission Possible a couple of years ago, looking at how do we abate all the hard to abate sectors, so cement, steel, plastics, aluminium, shipping, aviation, long distance trucking. And one of the, you know, most of the commissioners are CEOs of energy or energy intensive companies. And through the year that we were commissioning the research and reviewing findings, I could see everybody's eyes opening wide as we realized just how important hydrogen was going to be in the future energy economy. And that's because we really need to electrify as much as we can, which gives us direct efficiency benefits as well as reducing emissions through renewables. But there are some applications for which either the volumetric or the energy density requirement means that we just can't carry enough batteries to get the job done. So long distance trucking, possibly, although the jury's still out on that. Some companies are like Volvo and Daimler are betting on that being a fuel cell application. Others are thinking that batteries might extend to that application. Long distance shipping, aviation, and some of the chemical processes which require feedstocks like ammonia, and some of the processes require high temperature heat. So I think the other thing to say is that hydrogen as a gas also represents a possible business model innovation and a role for oil and gas companies, both producers and infrastructure players, looking for how they navigate this disruption towards net zero. People who've been around longer in the industry like to tell me that this is the third birth of the green hydrogen economy, so one should be a little bit guarded. But nevertheless, over the last year alone, we've seen 26 gigawatts of projects and 66 gigawatts of public sector targets announced for green hydrogen by 2030. That's according to Wood Mackenzie. And I see Hughes made a point in the chat about trains, obviously another long distance application if they're not electrified. And of course, as you mentioned, David, Kwasi Kwarteng's enthusiastic advocate, and the UK is preparing its own domestic hydrogen strategy. One thing I'd say through my work, it's really important that we look at the supply side and the demand side. If we get too excited about the supply side but haven't created demand pull, then we'll come to a sort of stuttering halt. In most geographies, it really does look like green hydrogen is going to be the winner economically, although at the moment, because there's not much green hydrogen, hydrogen produced from electrolysis using renewable energy. Most hydrogen at the moment is either grey, so it's steam reform methane, or blue, so the carbon is captured. But if you look at most of the projections in terms of the learning effect, it looks like the cost is going to come down very, very fast on green hydrogen. And of course, you've always got the problem with anything based on methane, that methane leakage is really bad news in terms of global warming. Recently, one of the most exciting things we've been involved in is as the high level champions, working with a whole series of partners. We've launched a green hydrogen catapult in December. That's 7 major energy players, and Yara, who's not an energy player, but one of the biggest fertilizer companies in the world, so a big ammonium player, launching a program. And we think that group's going to grow to get to 25 gigawatts deployed in the next 5 years. Because our assessment of the learning curve says that will get us to $2 per kilogram, which means that we then have green hydrogen cost competitive with fossil fuels, and then we can really start moving into the scaling up. So we've got to speed up the learning to get to cost competitiveness, and then we can scale up the deployment. That's going to take a whole system effort. As I say, that's the supply side, but then we have this Mission Possible platform, which is now a big collaboration with the World Economic Forum, the Women in Business, Rocky Mountain Institute, and the Energy Transitions Commission, working on these demand side clusters around shipping, aviation, trucking, steel, etc. And then on the government side, we have Mission Innovation and the Clean Energy Ministerial, and creative approaches like the Catapult Initiative and Breakthrough Energy. So I think there's a lot of stars aligning so that you can expect this to be a very rapid development, get the cost down, get the demand signal up. Final thing I'd say, of course, this changes the geopolitics of energy, because it means countries like Australia, South Africa, Chile, India, with very large land areas and a lot of sun, are all seeing that this could be a game-changing energy play, which means that they can export clean energy, which is a new business, as in Chile, or a replacement for a dying coal business, as in South Africa and Australia. So I think the sense that we're going to have a 10 to 15 times as big hydrogen economy by 2050 in order to get to net zero, and that all of that's going to be green, is one of the most exciting areas of this technological and economic transition that we're entering to right now. Thank you, David.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Nigel, and a really good sense there of just how rapidly things are moving and the potential of green hydrogen and the sense of the cost coming down. Let's now turn to Baroness Brown, Julia King, who is an engineer, a fellow member of the House of Lords, a crossbench peer. She was vice chair of the Climate Change Committee for 12 years, a member of the Hydrogen Advisory Council. She's a non-executive director of the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult, and was a non-executive director of the Green Investment Bank, and reported on decarbonising transport, a formidable expert in this area whose voice we very much value in the House of Lords. Julia, over to you.
Thank you very much, David. Let me just start sharing my screen. Right, I want to talk to you about the Climate Change Committee's balanced pathway to net zero and the role that hydrogen plays in that. And it, of course, picks up on quite a few of the things that Nigel has said, probably on a more international scale. So this demonstrates the kind of growth in hydrogen that the Committee on Climate Change, in its core scenario for getting to net zero, sees happening. And perhaps slightly surprisingly for some people, by the time we get to 2050, the main uses of hydrogen are thought to be the really economic uses of hydrogen are thought to be dominantly in shipping and in those areas of industry of manufacturing and construction where we're unable to decarbonize using electricity. But you see, we're also assuming on the Climate Change Committee a small amount of use in transport, including aviation, in buildings, both residential and non-residential, and some for peak lopping type power generation in a turbine when potentially the wind isn't blowing. So that's the picture. It's the growth of an industry from a very small base today to something like the size of our current electricity industry. So it's a huge growth over a period of 30 years. And here's the growth in the electricity system itself. We see a doubling in the size of the electricity system to 2050 as we as we electrify transport and a lot of our heating and some of our industrial processes. But on top of that electrification of our core economy, we see a significant amount of electricity being used for hydrogen production. And one of the things you'll notice on this chart, we have about 30% renewables on the grid today. By 2050, with the costs of renewables coming down so fast, we think the grid could be something like 80% renewable. So that hydrogen production, that 120 terawatt hours of hydrogen production is coming from generation that would otherwise have been curtailed. So that's very, very low cost electricity contributing to a very competitive cost of green hydrogen. This dramatic graph shows the reduction in gas use that underpins our net zero pathway. And you can see by 2050, we're projecting that there's about half the gas we use is used with carbon capture and storage to generate electricity directly, but the rest of the gas is being used for blue hydrogen production. And this just summarizes those two. Again, the hydrogen demand being by 2050 dominantly coming from manufacturing and construction and shipping in the form probably of ammonia, but small amounts going into buildings, to electricity generation and to transport. And that hydrogen coming, the majority of it coming from electrolysis as green hydrogen from that otherwise curtailed electricity, but possibly still some fossil hydrogen with CCS being produced and some further green hydrogen coming from biomass and perhaps some imports. But actually, in my more positive view, I think we might be seeing perhaps some exports. So let me just summarize that, which is to say that we're going to need hydrogen. It's going to be needed to decarbonize some key areas, and we may need it to support decarbonization in quite a broad range of areas to get the last bit of decarbonization that we can't do with electricity. The opportunities for the UK, I think, are very extensive. We have very low cost offshore wind, and we'll be trying to balance an 80% renewable grid by 2050. So there will be potentially a lot of curtailment and a lot of very cheap electricity at times when we don't otherwise need it. But of course, we also have phenomenal capacity for carbon storage around our coasts. So we're actually very well placed for doing carbon capture and storage, and so for reformation of methane and capturing the CO2. We've already got a really impressive UK supply chain with some key tech players like ITM Power making PEM electrolyzers. We've got Johnson Matthey, and Jane is talking to us next. We've got, as Nigel has mentioned, we've got the oil companies looking to being supplying this as a major fuel. We've got companies like Ceres Power and Intelligent Energy who make fuel cells. So we've got this is a real opportunity for us to be the original equipment manufacturers of the industry, as well as potentially to be, I think, exporters of hydrogen. And we've got a fantastic UK academic base in many of the key fields that underpin this. But as David has said, there is a challenge. The challenge is cost. You're making it either from methane or electricity, so it's going to be more expensive than either of those. So if you could use them directly, you will only use hydrogen where you have to. It's also a challenging molecule. It's very, very small. So if we worry about methane leakage, hydrogen leakage is going to be a challenge. It also embrittles high strength steels and welds. So we may have to do all sorts of additional testing of our transmission systems. Its energy density is a problem. We need, in order to store and transport it, you have to compress it and ideally even liquefy it. So that's a very energy intensive process. So storage and transport are absolutely critical. And we've got to think of it, oops, sorry about that. We've got to think of it, oh crumbs. We've got to think of it as a system. Many apologies. For some reason, my computer is playing games here. We've got to think of it as a system, and as I'm terribly sorry.
Don't worry, we can.
Here we are. We've got to think of it. We've got to think of it as a system. We've got, as Nigel so eloquently said, we've got to make sure that we develop the supply and demand at the same time. But actually, we've got to make sure we develop the transport and the storage and all the other elements of the system that are going to be critical. And we've got to make sure it integrates into our energy system. It's got to integrate into our electricity system, the opportunity from the curtailed renewable power. So it's a complex system integration problem, not just an individual technology problem. Oops, and now it's refusing to change my slides. There we are. So just finally, as Nigel has indicated, we've got lots of new policy coming out. We had the 10-point plan in November, committing to 40 gigawatts of offshore wind and 5 gigawatts of low carbon hydrogen production by 2030. We've got the energy white paper that came out in December. That turned the 5 gigawatts of low carbon hydrogen into 42 terawatt hours. That's about consistent with the Committee on Climate Change's scenario. We've got the Zero Carbon Hydrogen Fund. We've got the hydrogen strategy coming this year. Critically, next year, we've got the work on hydrogen business models and how you can make money out of this, whether there are going to be CFD type mechanisms to get things moving. By 2023, you're suggesting we will have 20% blend in the gas grid. And of course, we've got the work going on of the Hydrogen Council feeding very strongly into the hydrogen strategy that's being developed. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot of excitement about this. It's going to be a hugely important part of meeting net zero, but it isn't the silver bullet, and it will be the thing you use when you can't electrify and you've still got to get that last bit of emissions out. So I think it's very exciting and very important, but it isn't going to do everything. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julia. And those challenges and issues you identified are already coming up very strongly in the Q&A, and we will turn to them further after we've heard from our third speaker, Jane Toogood. And it's great that she has been able to join us. She is the Sector Chief Executive for Efficient Natural Resources at Johnson Matthey PLC. And Johnson Matthey is, of course, a major player in R&D for technologies moving us towards net zero emissions, including for producing clean hydrogen. And indeed, Jane sits on the UK government's Hydrogen Advisory Council. So thank you very much for joining us this evening, Jane. Over to you.
Thanks very much. And I'm hoping that my slides are going to appear on the screen. Thank you, Gavin. So look, thank you very much for inviting me today. It's quite possible you haven't really heard about Johnson Matthey, and we do a lot of business in the area of sustainability. Perhaps if we could just move on to the next slide, Gavin. We have a vision for a world that's cleaner and healthier today and for future generations. And 86% of our sales today are from products that contribute to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So we're very serious about this. I run the part of Johnson Matthey that is active in chemical production technologies, technologies for producing hydrogen, technologies for producing both green and blue, and also for assisting with grey hydrogen today. And we are very committed to helping the world actually to move forward on this. And when you consider that actually 57% of the global GDP today has got net zero targets associated with it, which has shifted dramatically in the last year, there is a great opportunity for companies, for British companies, that can make a difference here. We have a business around 100 million pounds in revenue associated with hydrogen, profitable business, and have been a leader in this area for many years. And when you think about the sorts of science that is going to be needed, it's not just about the technology itself of producing hydrogen, it's also enabling science for all the elements that are needed around it. Just like you talked about a moment ago, Julia, you have molecules that cause embrittlement. You need to make sure that you can deal with all of these aspects as well when you're looking at bringing new technologies to bear. So if we can just move through to the next slide, please. So as we were hearing earlier, decarbonisation, clearly having clean electricity is going to play a critical role in decarbonisation. And wherever possible, we want to be using renewable energy for light duty transport, for heating homes, for businesses, for most rail applications, and those light industrial processes. If you could move through, please. Where we are going to need hydrogen is where you've got those more energy intensive industrial uses, where there's more heavy duty transportation in marine, as we were hearing earlier, and indeed for that sort of longer range transport and for light duty, and for some of those rail applications as well. And hydrogen can be from a number of different sources. So if we can just move through, please. Because hydrogen is a wonderful small molecule. Not only can it enable the energy transition, but actually it is also quite fundamental as you start to look across the value chains into chemical building blocks, where you might be using even captured CO2 and combining that with hydrogen and using other processes to make those building blocks for chemicals we use today and that we need today. So, for example, ammonia that we talked about earlier, that can be used for crops, fertilizing crops, for methanol, things that we need for those consumer products that are consumed everywhere in the civilized world. So very, very important that we think of hydrogen as indeed part of a system, but part of a broad system that isn't just energy, but also about full value chains leading through to consumer goods. And we have companies in the UK like JM that are at the heart of some of that. You can move through to the next slide, please. So we are going to need a lot more hydrogen in the future, and it must be clean. This little projection here looks at how much hydrogen of the different types will be used in the future. And it's clear that we do need to disincentivize the use of grey with carbon taxes. So that's quite important how that whole carbon tax regime develops around the world. Blue adoption will be driven partly by the energy intensity of the usage, as we talked about earlier, partly by geology, because to use blue, you need to be able to capture the carbon dioxide that's produced on the way, partly also by the need for pace, because the planet can't wait for us to go through the technology learning curves that we need to get through, and we need to move at pace to decarbonize. So blue needs to be used to help that pace. But green also needs to be accelerated through into adoption. And green, of course, will be driven by geography, by the cost of renewable energy and that declining cost that Julia eloquently talked about a moment earlier, and of course by incentives. So what we're likely to see is a mix of all of those different types of hydrogen, with the grey diminishing, hopefully quite rapidly, and a move towards blue and green as we look towards 2050. So if you look through into the future, if you can just go through to the last piece here. In the UK, as we've discussed earlier with Julia and also with Nigel, we've got this opportunity, and a great opportunity in the UK, to be a leader in this space. And we've got some world leading initiatives going on. Our target that's been set in the 10-point plan of 5 gigawatts of hydrogen by the end of 2030 is on a par, I'd say, with, say, the target set by France and by Germany. We could possibly be even more successful by going faster. And I think that's one of our challenges, to see how we can accelerate and make sure that we are leaders, rather exporting rather than importing hydrogen in the UK. But I think when you look at that whole global market and what needs to happen around the world today, hydrogen in total can probably contribute decarbonisation of about 6 gigatons of the carbon dioxide, and that's compared to the 43 that needs to be done around the world. So to conclude, it's not going to actually get us to net zero around the world, but without it, we definitely are not going to get there. And we need to be moving at pace on blue, on green, and make sure we're learning fast, going through those technology learning curves. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Jane. Can I now invite all of our excellent panelists to turn on their video cameras? And we've got a fantastic amount of questions already pouring in, and a lot of them are turning around this kind of observation. It's a very tricky thing to use. People can see why we need it, but I think it was Julia who said it's a very small molecule. This makes it difficult, not straightforward. And let's start with the whole issue of its storage and transport. There's a question from Jeremy Watson, which has been very strongly endorsed. I mean, can we use the natural gas grid, or does that need to be, can it really handle hydrogen? And are we intending hydrogen to be widely used in homes? Perhaps, Julia, you might like to comment on that first.
Well, first of all, there's a lot of testing going on, both on distribution, transmission and distribution. But I think there's a very good confidence that the polyethylene pipe distribution system will be compatible with hydrogen. And of course, we're used in old town gas to having actually up to 50% hydrogen in our, if those of us who still remember town gas, in our systems. So I think there's confidence that the distribution system, certainly the modern polyethylene pipe system, will be fine. I think that, you know, there will be issues that it is a much smaller molecule, so there will be issues about making sure that the joins and things are actually have the integrity to cope with a much smaller molecule. So we need to find out more about some of those things. There are more challenges in the high pressure system, in that it's made of high strength steel with welds, but there's a lot of testing going on, and pipes can be lined. There are other solutions to that. So I think people are confident that we can get solutions that aren't too expensive. However, we think on the Committee on Climate Change, it is actually so much more efficient to heat our houses with electricity if they are properly insulated, that we think hydrogen will play a relatively small, although important, role in heating buildings. So we think that probably the most cost-effective route gives us something of the order of 10 or 11% of buildings being heated by hydrogen by 2050, and those being in areas close to industrial clusters, perhaps where hydrogen is being produced from methane with carbon capture and storage, or indeed close to areas where there's offshore wind electricity coming on board and coming ashore, and where there is there are a lot of electrolyzers. So places like around Hull and Grimsby, or up in the northwest, may be the initial candidates to have hydrogen in their heating systems.
Thank you very much, Jane. What's your view on how easy it is to store and transport?
I think Julia said it beautifully. Actually, it's, you know, exactly right. It can be problematic, but actually we do have some infrastructure that we can use already for hydrogen. And as you rightly said, for those of us that remember a bit about town gas, actually it used to be there. I think you summarised it very well, Julia.
I think perhaps just though we do need to recognise that if we're not transporting it in pipelines, the transport and storage is a challenge because we need to compress it. And there is some really exciting technologies, I think, that Jane may know much more about than I do, of absorbing hydrogen onto some very complex nanostructured particles and things like that to try and get the energy density up without actually having to use huge amounts of energy for compression.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
right, actually. And when you think about shipping hydrogen, I should add, of course, I mean, the whole theory of making it into ammonia and then shipping ammonia, which actually people are very used to shipping around the world, and there are good networks to do that, is of course one of the great ways to deal with this. Ammonia production is familiar, shipping ammonia is familiar, and therefore why not? And this is what will enable a good export market actually for this sort of energy.
I mean, David, like, just to pick up on that point, I think that there is a sort of safety cloud over the history of hydrogen, which a lot of people remember, dramatic. But of course, we have a hydrogen, there's an existing hydrogen industry. But I also think, I mean, Julia, one of the things that struck me most in the Climate Change Committee's advice on the 6th carbon budget is that, as you said, the balanced pathway gets us to net zero 2050, but the innovation pathway gets us to net zero, I think, 2042. And for me, there's a real question here about how confident. I feel we would need to be more confident in our engineers' ability to innovate, and we should be challenging ourselves. Because if we innovate faster, then British industry will get a bigger share of future markets. So for me, we really need to make sure we, rather than getting stuck on is safety a problem? It's like those who innovate fastest to overcome the challenges will be the ones who earn market share and build industries and build supply chains. So I'd be in favor of us being much more ambitious about our targets. We may have a legal target of 2050, but I think as a industrial sector, we should be looking to lead to get to net zero by 2042, because the analysis says that that's possible if we speed up the innovation.
Thanks very much. Let's move on from the kind of the transportation distribution issue to how effective we can be at getting to green hydrogen. I think there's again another undercurrent in the Q&A of we might find ourselves stuck with grey hydrogen. Imagine we are successful in tackling the distribution issues, and Julian and Jane sound very upbeat on that. Look at the way in which Germany is starting with grey hydrogen and then in theory moving on to green hydrogen. Look at their appalling record on brown coal. So is there a danger that we don't find the move to green hydrogen as easy as we might hope? And in the Q&A, there's a lot of jostling and arguing about what exactly is to be the best source of green hydrogen, by nuclear power stations, by offshore wind and other renewables, how actually we produce it. I think let's start with Julia on that. What do you think?
Well, if with nuclear as part of our electricity system, nuclear will be part of what we produce hydrogen with. But I think for me, the thing that will really unlock this is the fact that the renewables have become so cheap and are continuing to get cheaper, and solar and offshore wind, a grid which is 80% variable renewables. We will have to balance that grid. In a way, we will overbuild, if you like, on those cheap renewables because they're so cheap, and it will give us that incredible resource of otherwise curtailed, very cheap generation to produce electrolytic hydrogen. We have the electrolyzer technology. We've got ITM, a rapidly growing company with this relatively new PEM electrolyzer technology. So, we're starting to draw up plans to do this already, and it's absolutely sort of integral to a high renewables grid. It's a very, very logical thing to do with that very cheap, otherwise curtailed power.
Jane, your comments?
Okay, so I would probably comment on this not purely from a UK perspective here, but really, if you look globally, look, the transition that's got to happen, it is massive actually on a world scale, and that's why I was talking about the fact you need blue as well. You really do need blue so that you can go through, and there is technology. We have the technology. British company has the technology to produce blue that enables carbon capture at greater than 95%. Now, actually, it's not complete. In that sense, it's not as good as green, but it is actually extremely good if you're wanting to make a difference. And that's available today, and it will be essential where people can't get leveraged up to deliver, to scale up in green today. So blue is a big important part of the mix. And then over time, the world will shift again, as we go through the decades beyond. So I think that's quite important to bear in mind. The other thing I would mention as well is that as we do this, of course, everyone is becoming so much more alive to what it means. What is your carbon footprint, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions? And we will be looking at whole value chains and how whole value chains decarbonize. And that includes looking at the circularity of critical materials that are used on the way. So I think that will also make this a more complex discussion as time goes by. So.
Nigel, it'd be great to have your comments, and especially looking forward to COP26. How much do you think hydrogen will figure in the discussions there? Well, the mechanisms for getting to a zero carbon world, and to what extent will there be specific targets on green hydrogen, pressure on green hydrogen to ensure we don't get stuck with grey hydrogen? What's your forecast?
Well, first of all, of course, there's a danger we don't get to grey hydrogen. There's two dangers. One, we don't get to green hydrogen. There's a danger we don't do that globally. Then, as Jane and Julia have explained much more eloquently and technically competent than me, then we don't get to net zero, right? So that's not a path that any one of us choose. And then, but the other danger is that the UK doesn't get to green hydrogen and other people do because we don't commit to it early enough, and then we're just importing technology. And I'm with Julia. I think this is, and Jane, I think if we move fast enough, there's a big opportunity to take a technical lead. To your specific question, David, about Glasgow, of course, the COP, the Conference of the Parties, the multilateral process, will not be a negotiation about how much green hydrogen we're going to produce. That conversation is much more it's a combination between the public sector and the private sector, and I think that there's so much going on. As I say, the Green Hydrogen Catapult just launched. The Mission Innovation, I suspect, will be doing something big on hydrogen. I think that you can expect quite a few big announcements about collaborations and commitments on green hydrogen to be part of the broader conversation and context in Glasgow, without a doubt. You just see it. There's almost every week there's somebody else joining it. Just recently South Africa, who've been spending so much time worrying about how they get off coal, now thinking much more about the huge opportunity they have on hydrogen. Similarly, Australia, so I think that they're starting to realize it could be part of their just transition, where it actually provides a future for people working in the coal industry as they make that transition quickly. So I think for several reasons, it will be in the conversation quite significantly in Glasgow, but it won't be part of the negotiations.
Thanks for making that clear. So many different questions. I think partly prompted by Julia's very eloquent explanation of hydrogen and offshore renewables is a great use of the wind power and the tidal power when we aren't all having to make our cups of tea in a half time in the cup final. What about the other possible sources of hydrogen? There's some people. There's a popular question about nuclear power. Will advanced modular reactors and others contribute? There's also been a question about solar power as a means of generating hydrogen. There are people who believe you can use tidal energy and ocean currents. So just take us through what you think are the most feasible means of producing this green technology. There are some people who are looking beyond offshore wind. Julia, why don't you comment first?
Well, if you're in the Gulf or in Chile, or indeed as Nigel said, in Australia, solar will be a brilliant way to make it and extraordinarily cheap. Solar is like offshore wind, like nuclear, are all just contributors to our grid. And the challenge, is always balancing supply and demand. So they will all contribute really well to hydrogen. Solar, you might say, well, actually, we get most solar in the middle of the summer when actually we don't need it. So there's a chance to make hydrogen. Nuclear in some ways is just as difficult to balance on a grid as a variable renewable, because nuclear is there all the time and demand isn't there all the time. So there's an opportunity for making hydrogen. So all of these things in the way we run our grid will contribute potentially very positively. But you know that because there is likely to be such a high level of cheap renewables on the grid, and that's solar and wind, the issue of balancing and curtailment gives that really big opportunity, particularly for us in the UK.
Thank you very much. Jane, your comments?
I mean, fundamentally, to enable green hydrogen, you need cost-effective electricity, okay, from whatever source that comes, whichever renewable source that comes. So that's the real driver. I mean, ultimately, again, for all of these, you're going to need good business models. And I talked earlier about carbon tax, but actually you need a good business model that incentivizes the move. And that covers both, you know, that covers demand as well as supply. So you have to have an appropriate business model that works. But it's all about having a cheap source of electricity. At the same time, they're quite new technologies that are coming in, and there is that aspect of learning through scale, which every industry goes through. You know, well documented fact. You have to learn how to do these things at scale, and that takes a little bit of time. We can accelerate that, which is what we talked about before, and we should try to accelerate it. But you have to go through the learning curve, and that will also be quite important if we really want to deploy at scale. But fundamentally, you need a sufficient quantity of a reasonable price electricity, renewable electricity source.
I think one of the exciting opportunities of getting us up to scale, actually, whilst in the CCC we don't think there'll be an enormous proportion of homes running on hydrogen by 2050. Actually, the real opportunity for getting us up to scale is that we can put 20% of hydrogen into the gas grid. So you've got somewhere for it to go. It may not be the most cost-effective thing, but if we're going to do what we've done for offshore wind and get up to scale quickly, that's a brilliant and simple way to do it.
Yeah, that's a good thing.
Thanks. Nigel, it'd be great to have your comments on this, and particularly going back to what the policy instruments are, because in a way there's one wonderful picture where it's just the sheer success of renewables means that we have a lot of renewable energy around at the times when it's not directly being needed. So we can use that to produce hydrogen. There's a bit of a debate going on in the Q&A about whether you would need a carbon tax and how effective a carbon tax would be. Do you think there are other policy instruments needed to get us to green hydrogen, or do you think that the two, that carbon tax and the optimism about offshore renewables will do the work?
I mean, as we've discussed, it's a whole systems shift. So I think there's more than one policy instrument. I've just posted in there's a really nice micro example of what Julia describes as basically the effect, almost zero marginal cost renewables being a source for very, very cheap hydrogen in the Orkneys. There's a little mini hydrogen economy developed in the Orkneys where they've got way more power than they can consume locally. So they now have hydrogen, and they have some hydrogen propelled boats servicing the wind turbine. So, but I think, big renewables helps us get the excess power that gives us that sort of low marginal or almost zero marginal cost. We targeted R&D spend, early, it's classic early stage. As Jane says, we've got to speed up down the cost curve, and that's a volume play. So if we sit around waiting for markets to do that, that'll take a long time. So that's a great place that's the kind of thing that Mariana Mazzucato talks about in terms of the entrepreneurial state. So state investment in early stage, that's more the mission innovation type play. That really helps. That draws on the best of our academics, but then gets it from the lab into the field. And then there are other ideas that we can learn from the lessons we've learned in renewables. Like I can't remember if it was Julia or Jane earlier mentioned the idea, for example, contracts for difference, so that we're starting to structurally create demand. And I agree with Julia. It's injecting hydrogen into the thermal grid. Blue or green. I agree with you, James. It's a great way of generating demand in the short term to help us get down the cost curve. So I think yes, carbon tax is helpful, but also straightforward renewable energy commitments like we've got, CFDs, and then R&D until we've got past the kind of cost inflection point.
And I must say, and you might, thank you, Nigel, you might want to comment on this further. Looking at it from a more political lens, every time one talks about hydrogen and you hear the places that are named, Orkneys, Hull, Grimsby, potential in the northeast, you do see, in terms of the government's place agenda, this is absolutely the right kind of industry that they would wish to promote. And presumably that, and the link of that is another attraction, and presumably is giving it further impetus. Is that right, Nigel?
Well, I think so, and it's part of this whole idea of a just transition. I mean, we talk about leveling up in the UK, but it's a global issue, right? It's how do we, you know, we're taking jobs out of parts of the energy sector. We need to, you know, those communities are going to need to work. So it definitely, I mean, I ran a business in Hartlepool for several years, and that was, you know, in the early 2000s. That is a region that has lost more than one industry. Right, so the fact that we're now seeing these new industrial clusters in the northeast is really exciting, and very exciting for, you know, for generations who've really struggled to see where the jobs of the future are going to come from. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right to mention that. We shouldn't underestimate the importance of that at all.
Thanks. Now I'm going to now turn to a question which Rick Parker has put, and which has had quite a lot of support, and which is one specific area, which is flying. As we think about the difficult areas where the conventional electricity supply won't work, we seem to be somewhere off from, there are some electric planes, but we're not at all confident we've got batteries that are ever going to make it efficient. Is hydrogen a way of fueling flight, or what else will be used? Julia, why don't you comment first?
Well, of course, there are some. You know, there is the Cranfield have flown an electric hydrogen hybrid aircraft, I believe. But the hydrogen in aviation in our committee on climate change committee projections for 2050 is actually hydrogen, green hydrogen, being used with captured CO2 in order to produce synthetic aviation fuel. So it's a very green fuel, unfortunately very energy intensive to produce, but certainly, you know, part of the story of decarbonising aviation. So that's where the hydrogen that's on the charts that I showed you. But that's not to say we aren't hoping there might be other innovations with hydrogen in aviation, but we like to do our central scenario on things that we know can be done rather than things that we think might be done.
Thanks. Jane?
Yes, I mean, there are other things that are also being worked on, things like waste to aviation fuel, which are other routes, of course, to decarbonise aviation. And I think there's also work, of course, on battery powered aviation. And actually, again, I suspect that what we'll need is developments across several fronts here. I don't think it's obvious yet that there is any one particular route that will go forward. We need advancements in innovation.
I suspect Rick should be answering this question.
Well, I'm acting as his spokesman on this occasion, and it's a great honor to do so.
David, I think it's just worth reflecting on how big the innovation challenge is here. I mean, you know, again, in the Energy Transitions Commission, we basically saw four routes. There's the electrification. You know, Norway's already said all domestic flights will be electric by 2040. So short haul, there's definitely a role. Then there's the more efficient airframes, and there's air traffic control things. But most people seem to believe that we're going to have sustainable aviation fuels. And as we've heard, there's more than one route to those. But in terms of the challenge today, sustainable aviation fuels make up 0.01% of the global fuel mix, so 1/100 of 1%. So one of the things that we've been trying to do in building pathways to zero is actually reflect the knowledge that we have of the way industrial transformation happens. They follow an S-curve. So if we can get to 2% sustainable aviation fuel by 2025, that doesn't feel like much. So, you know, if you're really desperate to get to zero, then 2% feels like a weak commitment. But when you know that we're starting from 0.01, so it's a 200x from today. So that's the sort of thing we're seeing people converge on, and getting to 10, 15%. The Dutch, I think, have a mandate now for 14%. I think the French, in their bailout of Air France, have made a mandate of 10% by 2030. So I think we'll be seeing countries and the whole value chain converging around that kind of S-curve to get potentially 1,000 times the amount of sustainable aviation fuel by 2030. That's still only 10%. But again, as with hydrogen, once we've gone down the cost curve by getting that 1,000x, we should be in a much clearer position to know what the winning technologies are and have them be in a position to compete with kerosene.
Yeah, and just more widely, you reminded us again, Nigel, of the excellent work of the Energy Transition Committee under Adair Turner. just remind us, as you look forward to 2040, 2050, where from that committee's work and elsewhere, where do you see the key uses of hydrogen? Which are the key sectors? Where we're going to see it?
Well, we've talked about it's shipping, probably long distance trucking. Although, as I say, even within the industry, that's an engineering debate right now, and the engineering, how far can you push batteries, and then some of the high temperature heat applications. And I think also interesting, we haven't talked possibly as a reducing agent for steel to get away with coke and coal and move towards, but again, there's competing technologies, but there are some, the first, I think is it the HYBRIT in Sweden, I think we now have a hydrogen reduction steel plant for making green steel. So that's potentially the path of green steel.
Good. Thank you all very much indeed. Now, we've just got 5 minutes left. And what I'm going to do is ask each of our panelists to pull the threads together and particularly to focus on what are the policy levers that still need to be pulled. If we are to harness green hydrogen, what is it further that requires government action, co-investment, policy levers? If you were sitting alongside Kwasi Kwarteng on the Hydrogen Council, what would you be telling him in the coming budget, in the negotiations at COP26 elsewhere, needs to be done? Let's start with you, Jane. What would you like to see? And give us your final observations on this evening.
Okay. Well, apart from carbon tax, which we talked about, contract for difference, I think, is extremely important, and appropriate business models, therefore, to drive the industry forward and enable the industry. Support for R&D into developing new technology, developing further technologies, done on a collaborative basis. This is all better done in collaboration, actually. And it's also very important that as we get initial projects going, that there is some support so that industry and government can invest coincidentally on those projects to prove technology and to prove scale. So those are things that I think would be important, quite apart from the fact, of course, we need to make sure that we're delivering cohesive messages to users of energy so that people can understand the sort of change that needs to happen and can buy into that.
Thank you very much. Julia?
I think alongside that, I mean, I agree very much with what Jane has said. And I think there's some kind of CFD mechanism which gets the competition, which has been so successful in bringing costs down in offshore wind. But I think in order to do that, we're going to need some kinds of hydrogen standards. And we're going to need to be able to say, this is hydrogen that was made with 95% carbon capture and storage. We're going to need to know this is hydrogen that was made with 99% carbon capture and storage, sort of accredited. And this is green electrolytic hydrogen, because those contracts for difference are going to need to be different for those different, if you like, qualities or greennesses of hydrogen. And so we're going to need a way of knowing what kind of hydrogen it is so that we know how to support it in the early days.
Thank you very much, Julia. And Nigel, very good of you to spare the time. You give us your final observations, and particularly on the policies.
The first thing I would do is I would say let's have an industrial strategy that backs British engineering and targets net zero 2042. So I would really try and squeeze that, because that's what's going to drive industrial competitiveness, as long as it's then backed up with the range of policies which Jane and Julia talks about. So yes, support for R&D and early stage projects, that first 25 gigawatts to get down the cost curve, and on the demand side as well. So for example, let's, if we have a commitment to build some of the early hydrogen fueling stations so that several long distance trucking routes are amenable to fuel cells, then Hyundai have fuel cell trucks running in Switzerland. Volvo and Daimler are committed to having 100 fuel cell trucks each on the road by the end of this year. If the UK has committed to fuel cell recharging infrastructure, refueling, then there's a much better chance of those trucks being on UK roads as well as some other countries. So I think just really see this as a competitiveness play, and back British engineering with that sort of whole industrial strategy around supply and demand.
Yeah, Thank you very much indeed for that. Well, what a fantastic hour discussion we've had. I'm very grateful to our three excellent panelists, Nigel Topping, Julia King, Jane Toogood. Thank you very much for joining us. It is a measure of the interest we've had. We're scoring 78 questions on the Q&A, which I think might be a record for the Foundation of Science and Technology. And I think that reflects the fact that people are absolutely fascinated by the potential of hydrogen to help out, but also it is tricky. It is not straightforward. And there's been a series of questions, which I hope we've been able to capture, about how you actually produce it in a green way and how you then transmit it and use it. But thank you very much indeed for joining us. Our next event will be on the 24th of March. And then we're discussing the effects of the coronavirus lockdown on the mental health of children and young people. Thank you all very much indeed for joining us this evening. Particular thanks to our panelists, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, everybody.